Hi everyone, it's Danny. Okay, so one of my viewers suggested that I make a video on orchid roots in general, specifically how to know if the roots on our orchids are healthy or not. So in this video, I will take the most common orchids you can find out there and maybe some not so common orchids, and I'll show you how healthy roots should look like and also how some unhealthy roots look like. Okay, let us start with Cattleya orchids. Now these types of orchids produce usually white roots, so usually healthy roots on a Cattleya orchid should be white or light in color. Sometimes they can get a bit stained from the media, but they should not get to the point of being super dark brown with staining. So healthy roots, when they are watered, should be a bit green, as you can see in this case. If they are dry, they will be white. If you see growing tips, green growing tips, this is always a good sign. This means the orchid is actively producing roots, and these roots are very healthy. So your Cattleya orchid should look something like this. As you can see, all the roots are pretty green or pretty white. There are no very brown or dark looking roots. So this is a healthy root system for a Cattleya orchid. Unhealthy roots are usually very dark brown, and sometimes it can appear that they are mushy even though you cannot feel them. And I'll give you an example. Hopefully you can see what I have here. These roots that you see on the bottom are very dark, and if you can notice, they're not really plump. They do look like they're a bit mushy. Now these roots are certainly very sick, if not actually dead. So if your orchid has these types of roots all over the pot, then it means that your orchid has a very serious issue, and you should repot it and remove all the dead roots. Now if you noticed, I usually use clear plastic pots with any of my orchids. When I repot them, I do switch them to the clear pots because I can see the root system. In many cases though, Cattleyas do not come in clear plastic pots, so there's no way to check the root system inside the pot. The best thing you can do is actually check the roots at the surface of the media. If you can notice, in this case, I do have some white roots quite on top of the media. This means that the orchid does have some good roots. You don't know what's going on in the pot, but outside, on the surface, at least it has a few good roots. If, however, your orchid does not seem to have any white roots on the top, then it might be that you have a problem on your hands. So take a look at these roots. They're not really white. They're not even green. They're actually pretty brownish. Now, I can assure you these roots might not be dead, but they're certainly suffering. So if your Cattleya orchid looks like this, you might want to repot it and take a look inside the media. Maybe the media is going bad. Also, look here, very dark roots. This is not what you want to see on your Cattleya orchid. For Oncidium orchids, things are pretty much the same. They produce white roots as well. If you have green tips on the roots, this is a very good sign. This means that the roots are actively growing. However, for Oncidiums, the roots might not turn as green as for Cattleyas. So if your root system looks white but does not turn very green when you water it, it doesn't mean the roots are dead. As I told you, check for the greenish root tips. Also, if after watering the roots really do stay white and plump, this is a very good sign. So this is a very healthy root system for an Oncidium orchid. Dead roots or very unhealthy roots are usually brown on Oncidium orchids, but it's not really a rule. Sometimes it can stay white. For the main part though, if you see these types of roots on your Oncidium orchid, again, look at the consistency of the roots as well. This means you're having yourself a very unhealthy root system on your Oncidium orchid. However, you can guess the state of a root system if you actually look at the orchid. If its pseudobulbs are starting to shrivel no matter how much you water, you definitely have a root system problem. This especially is helpful when you don't have clear plastic pots to check the root system. So the best way to know if your Oncidium has a root problem or not is to look at the pseudobulbs. If they continue to shrivel no matter how much you water the orchid, you definitely have a problem with the root system. When you unpot it and you notice these types of roots on it, you will feel that they are very mushy and they should be removed. Cattleya orchids as well will tell you through their pseudobulbs if they have healthy roots or not. If the pseudobulbs on the Cattleya orchids that I showed you earlier start to shrivel as well, no matter how much you water, you definitely have a root system problem. With Phalaenopsis orchid roots, it's really easy to tell the difference between healthy roots and unhealthy roots. When they are not watered, the roots are actually silvery. It doesn't mean that they should be dry or desiccated. Green root tips, again, is a very good sign. If the roots are very stiff and plump and they don't seem to be papery, you're having yourself a healthy root. Now, the moment you will water it, you'll notice that the roots will go very, very green. This means the orchid is watered and the roots are healthy. They're absorbing water. Now, on my Phalaenopsis here, I have an example of a dead root, just to show you how it looks like. So hopefully you can see this root. It is not green anymore, it is not silvery, it does not look plump just by looking at it. Now, this obviously is a dead root. If you have only these types of roots in your Phalaenopsis orchid pot, you're in big trouble. You need to repot this orchid and cut away all the dead roots. One or two roots like this in your pot doesn't really mean anything. Sometimes it happens if you have more healthy roots like this one than unhealthy roots like this one. Everything should be fine. One dead root in a pot doesn't mean you need to repot your orchid, doesn't mean it's a sick orchid. But if you have mostly roots like this in your orchid pot, then definitely your orchid has a root problem. Vanda orchid roots are pretty much like Phalaenopsis roots actually. When they are watered, they should become this really pretty green. Also, the green root tips indicate that the roots are healthy and they are growing. When your Vanda orchid is dry, the roots will become silvery, but they will still be plump and they will have consistency. A root system like this is a very healthy root system on a Vanda orchid. The way to know if your Vanda orchid has some dead roots is actually pretty easy. If you look at the roots, you will notice they are pretty plump and consistent. This is how they should be. Dead roots, on the other hand, are very papery, look desiccated, and also when you water them, they will not turn green. So I think this is very obvious. The difference between healthy roots and not healthy roots and actually dead roots is very obvious. So if your Vanda orchid only has very papery looking roots and not plump, they don't turn green when you water it, you can actually have a very sick orchid on your hand. And Grecham orchid roots are pretty much like Vanda roots. They should be pretty silvery when they're not wet, and when you water them, they will turn a bit more green. With this type of orchid, you do need to look at the consistency of the root. If it seems plump, everything is pretty much okay, but if it looks very papery and desiccated, then maybe you have a problem inside your pot and you would need to address it. But if the vast majority of the root system looks silvery when it's not wet or a bit green when it's wet, then everything is fine. As long as the roots are plump, your Angraecum should have a good root system. Dendrobium orchid roots, whether they're Phalaenopsis or Nobile types, usually have the same type of roots as Oncidiums. When they sprout, they can be very white and nice. When they get watered as they age, they can turn to green. So if you have these types of roots in your Dendrobium pot, you're fine. This is a healthy root system for a Dendrobium orchid. However, if your Dendrobium orchid seems to have brownish looking roots, this is not a very good sign, and you should definitely take a look inside and see if you don't have a root problem on your hand. So if you take a look at these roots, you can actually tell they're not very healthy. If you press on them, they're not stiff, they're pretty mushy, so it's definitely a sign that your orchid is struggling, and you should definitely unpot it and take a look at the root system. Brown roots can actually naturally occur for some orchids. For example, the Paphiopedilum orchid naturally has brown roots. This doesn't mean they're sick or they're going rotten. With Paphiopedilum orchids, you actually need to look for yellow root tips. This means the root is actively growing and is really healthy. So if you see this type of roots on your Paphiopedilum orchid, don't worry, they're very normal. However, if the roots on your Paphiopedilum look very dark, almost black, and also you cannot see any yellow tips on them, you might have a problem with your Paphiopedilum, so you need to unpot it and actually check the root system. Some Maxillaria orchids, if not the vast majority of them, do not produce green or white roots either. This is a Maxillaria rufensis, and if we look at the root system, we can actually see it's kind of reddish and kind of brownish. Now this is very normal for this orchid, and if you can actually notice here, I do have growing tips, even if they're reddish or yellowish in color. So if you see this on your Maxillaria orchid, don't worry. It usually produces brownish reddish roots, and it's nothing to worry about. Again, if you see very dark roots inside the pot of your Maxillaria, that could be a reason for worry, and you need to repot your orchid and check the root system properly. The green root tips are not necessarily a must for all orchids. Some orchids naturally produce yellowish root tips. This is the case for Catasetum type orchids. You shouldn't worry if you see that the tips on your Catasetum orchid are pretty yellowish. This is normal for this type of orchid. If the roots have the tips, they're white and they pretty much green up when you water them. This is a good sign for Catasetum orchids. Suffering or dead roots on a Catasetum orchid usually are very dark brown, and they seem to not have any consistency left. So if your Catasetum has only roots of this kind, then you should be worried about it. 1 or 2 roots are perfectly fine, and if you have the vast majority of the roots healthy, you shouldn't really worry about it. But if you have an abundance of very dark brown looking roots, then definitely your orchid has a major problem. Okay, so this was about it on orchid roots. There are so many orchid types that it's pretty hard to present everything in one video. But keep in mind that usually the orchids that produce white roots will have problems if the roots look very dark brown, and also they're not plump anymore and they don't have any green root tips. For orchids that are related between them, you can pretty much apply these symptoms to all of them. For example, Callia orchids, Encyclia orchids, Brassavola orchids, and Epidendrum orchids, they all pretty much should have the same root types, meaning that they should be white, they should have green root tips, and so on. If they're pretty dark brown, then you need to address the issue with any of them, and so on. Also, Oncidium hybrids and intergenerics should have pretty much the same characteristics when it comes to the root system. So whatever I said about Oncidium orchids can be applied to Oncidium intergenerics and Oncidium relatives in general. Okay, thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. If you want to see more videos from me, don't forget to subscribe. You can leave me suggestions or questions in the comment section below. Also, if you still have questions about orchid roots, maybe I forgot to mention something, just leave me a comment below. And if you just want to stay in touch with me, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I'll see you next time. Bye!